Hello, and welcome back to CodeBytes TV screencasts. Today, we'll be discussing API consumption using the React framework by Facebook. In today's screencast, we will start not with an empty Rails project, but with the Rails project that we created in the previous screencast that created an API using Grape. If you don't have that code available or want to start fresh, please feel free to grab the code from GitHub. Once we're set up, we will go through and create a basic React front end to Consumer API. However, before we do that, I'd like to take a couple minutes and just go over the basics of what is React. So React is, in the simplest terms, a client-side framework used to render JavaScript components. It's that simple. And these components usually will turn into a regular HTML page, like a form, or receiving AJAX data from the server and updating the form, or updating page components based off of user interaction. If you are familiar with the MVC framework model, then you can think of this as the view part of such a framework. If you're not familiar with MVC, don't worry, we really won't be getting into it here. A paradigm that does not share with many other frameworks, especially Vue frameworks, is that React believes in keeping rendering logic and the you could say template together. So unlike something like Handlebars, which has separate templates and rendering logic, they are all combined into one component for React. And then these components are organized into a hierarchy that is then rendered on your screen. As we build out the application, I will explain more about rendering and rendering hierarchy, so you don't need to understand it here. There are three parts of React we should cover and just explain a little bit about before we start coding, because they'll be important and I want you to understand what's happening when you see it. The first are props, short for properties, which you can think of as immutable state for a React component that's passed in at creation time and acts as configuration. Since your component can't change, think of this as passing in state that the component will always hold to and will not be able to change. The next thing is actual state, which is mutable by the component. So what happens when a state changes is the component will re-render itself. So properties and state should come together to form a rendered component that when state changes will re-render, and if properties and state are the same, no matter how many times you re-render the component, it should always render the same way. This is best thought of as holding user state, as the name implies. So these are pieces of data that the user can or will want to change, and that when they change should have some type of result in some type of rendering change on the view. And lastly, there are refs. And all a ref is a reference to an actual HTML component, so that you can use these mostly for event binding or updating state. So if someone changes a text field and you want to store that in the state, you'll need to have a reference, ref, to that component so you can grab the change data. And now, let's start coding and actually looking into how to use React to create a web page that you could show to your customers, clients, or just yourself and your friends. As I stated at the beginning of this screencast, we are going to start not with a blank application, but with the code that we had at our last screencast, so just the raw API. So I'm going to clone that. All right, now that it's cloned, we will go into here, open our editor. Once again, I'm using Atom, but that's a personal choice. I'm not here to say which editor is better than any other editor. And just like when we did our Grape API, there's some configurations we need to do first. First of all, we need to add in a gem to make it easy to access React. Now, you could manually require React, And there's nothing wrong with that, but the gem makes it easier. So we'll just add in React Rails. We want at least the 1.0 version, and then we'll bundle this. Once again, I already have this gem installed, so it bundles very quickly for me, but just keep in mind it will take longer if you don't have this gem installed. The next step, we need to run the generator associated with this gem, so the React install, which will configure our project to serve React. And let's take a moment to look at what it did. So if you go under your application, under assets, we now have this components directory, components.js, which requires any file in the components directory. And then under application.js, we require React, React.ujs, and then the components file as well. So now that it's set up the basics, we can actually get started to create our first application. Well, almost. We'll have to add a controller to actually serve our application. So we'll just create a quick controller here. Let's call this main controller for the lack of a better name for it. We'll give this an index method. And we'll just mount this to our root. We'll go to main index, and then in our views, we'll create one, give it a title. We'll call this currency converter. We'll save this, and we'll start our server. And we start it, and here we go. We hit our main page. It renders the view. Now we can actually get into creating our React API. So I will add in one line of code here that's kind of putting the cart before the horse by calling this helper that is provided by the React Rails gem. It's called a React component. You pass in the name of the component, which we'll create in a little bit, and then you pass in any properties. Remember the props we talked about? This is how we pass them in from Rails into our JavaScript component. And so when this page is rendered, it will try to render this component. If we inspect this after we refresh the page, we'll see we're getting an error. This exchange is not defined. So let's solve this by actually going to create the exchange component. So when we want to create a component, we'll just simply create a file under our components directory, exchange.js.jsx. Now you may be wondering what the JSX is. This is really just syntactic sugar that makes it easier to render the HTML, and I'll explain a little bit more as we get closer to that. Now to define the exchange, we just create a variable and make it a React class. Now with this saved, we can render this page, and you can see it's no longer complaining that the exchange is not defined. It's defined, but we haven't created a render method. So we'll go back here and we'll create a render method. Now this is where we get into the JSX. So we'll return, and here, because this is JSX, we can simply start typing HTML in our render form, in our render return. So we'll create a form here, and the first thing we'll do is we'll create a input for our currency amount and choose the currency type we want to convert it into. So this is just going to be a simple form, so I'm not going to bother typing it in front of you. I'm just going to paste it in really quick so we can get on with looking more into React. All right, so I just pasted this code in. All I'm doing is creating a form, so I have a label, a text field, so we can enter an amount. We have our select currency, which is currently blank, and then a button that tries to submit it and does nothing really. Okay, The next step is we want to fill in this currency dropdown. In our main view, we passed in currencies, and we had 3 different currencies here. Now these are available to us in our exchange component as props. This is the currency property. So what we can do is in our render method, we can create a var currency options, and this is props.currencies. Now this references the component, so exchange. Props is anything you passed into it, and then currencies is the name of that. So we can map these together. If I spell it right, function to the currency, and anywhere you have a return, you can use the JSX. So we don't have to do string manipulation. We just say option currency, and we're good. The curly brackets denote passing in some type of JavaScript variable or calling a function. So in this case, we're iterating over each of our currencies, putting it into the currency variable, and then placing that into the option. Then we can take this currency options and place it into our select statement. So we'll do the same thing here, curly brackets, and then just type in currency options, save that, refresh our page, and now you can see that we have all of our passed in currency options shown in our drop-down box. So now we have our basic form, it's rendered. Now it doesn't do anything. I click this button and nothing happens. So the next step is obviously going to be actually when we submit the form to submit it to the server and process the results that comes back displayed to the user. So in order to submit this to the server, I'm going to have to capture the form submit event. So the easiest way to do this in React is just add an on submit tag, and you can put in a method here so you don't have to reference some, catch it, capture the event, respond to the event. All you need to do here is say this dot handle submit. Now you may be wondering what handle submit is. We'll define that now. All it is another method in this component. And I can show this working by preventing default so it doesn't submit the form, and we'll just create a console message here. Save this, refresh our page. So I submit my form, and you see the page doesn't change, and I get the console message that we created. But to really make this useful, we need to submit an AJAX request. So here, we'll get rid of our console, since we don't need that anymore. We proved it works. And we'll just be using jQuery here to submit an AJAX request. So we want to have the URL, which will be the same one we used last time. API v1 converter exchange. We'll have the data type of JSON, so that it parses the JSON when it comes back for us. And now we want to have the data hash, so actually pass in the values in our form. And this is where we'll use React again. So we have 2 items, we have the amount and the toCurrency. Before I just type this code in, I want to go over how you would find the text field with the amount and the drop-down box with the toCurrency. As you'll see here, we created the refs. So an ref equals amount and an ref to currency. These are special React attributes that I can use now. So when I want to grab the values here, I can just do React find DOM node and this dot refs dot amount. And this will return the actual HTML component, the actual DOM component. So you can call value on this, and we'll trim that, and that's our amount. And we'll do the same thing with toCurrency. Well, we don't want to cache this. And then right now, just to prove that it's working, we'll have a success function that will just once again log the data we get back to the console. Okay, now it refreshes properly. We'll put it in an amount here. We'll exchange it. And in our console, you'll see we see the actual response from our server. We have amount of 345 new Taiwanese dollars. And you can see that, yes, this request did actually go to our server. You'll see it passed in and it responded. So this is the basics and kind of say the main component in our application. This is the one that's rendered first and the one that our Rails view actually renders and calls. Now the next step is to create a subcomponent that will render the results of our API call. And this will demonstrate how React renders in a hierarchy. So what we'll do now is we'll create our new component, which we'll call conversion result. So we'll do the same thing that we did for exchange. We'll create our conversion result variable, be react.create class, and we'll create our render method. Now, all we really need to do is render out the result, which we'll pass in as properties. So we'll just put in a span here, it's fine. So the conversion result is, I'm gonna have the properties amount, and this will be the properties for the currency. So we'll save that. And then what we'll do next in our component, our main component, is we will render this component as a subcomponent. So in here, we can just add a line, conversion result, amount, and to currency. All right, let me take a minute to unpack this. Conversion result should be very familiar because this is the React class we're creating in the conversion result variable. So this is telling JSX, when you compile this, go render the conversion result component. The amount and the currency, these are the properties that we're passing into the conversion result. Now, this is an important convention, is to pass in a parent component state as properties in a subcomponent, because the parent is what's changing the state. So the subcomponent should not be able to do so, so it becomes a property. The important thing is because this is state in the parent component, whenever the state changes, it will re-render itself, and when it renders itself, we'll re-render all of its subcomponents. So if we refresh our page here, we'll see it raises an error. It says cannot read property amount of null. And the reason for this is that we haven't set any initial values for our state. So it's null and doesn't know what to do. So we can create a special method called initial state, which will be called by React when the component first runs to get a state that we can use for the first time. So in this case, we'll just put in a blank amount and a blank to currency. When we refresh this page, we see an error, which is not what we want. So let's look at that real quick. Oh, yes, the problem here is this needs to be returned. Okay, there we go. So if you missed that really quick, the problem was I didn't return the string, so it didn't know what to make the component out of. So now that I've done that, it renders properly, and I get the string, which is empty. So even when I submit it, you'll notice it's still empty. So we need to connect the response from the AJAX request to our state, because when we change our state, we'll re-render our component and change the result. So to do that is extremely simple. Here, all we need to do in our response is call the setState method. And this just accepts an object. So we can put an amount, which will be equal to our data, the returned data from the server, to amount, and to currency, which is passed back from the server as this currency. And we don't need to log this to the console anymore. And now one thing to keep in mind is this, we need to make sure is bound to the correct item, make this correct. So in this case, we want to bind this function to this, and in this case, this is referring to our Exchange React component. And we'll come here, we'll refresh our page, we'll put in an amount again, And boom, when we exchange it, you'll see the results show up here. So now this is working properly. Now the next question is what happens when we have an error? Well, obviously, we get a response that's an error back, but our conversion results don't change and we never show that error. Now, the error component is virtually identical to the conversion component. So I'm quickly just going to paste that code in and we'll go over it very briefly. I mean, to create a result, boom, it puts it out. But if we get an error back, we'll see we get the actual message returned from the server and it clears our results. Now, just to wrap things up with a few housekeeping, for more information about React, check out their website at facebook.github.io/react. And as always, you can find the code for this episode at GitHub CodeBytesTV, and then that's just the React_UI. Once again, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.